The council announced war. She only smiled and said, "At last." Part 1. The vote that was supposed to break us. The chamber smelled like old decisions. That is the first thing I noticed when I walked into the Grand Council Hall on Station Orange 7. Not the gold-laced columns that stretched 30 meters above our heads. Not the 12 alien delegations arranged in a horseshoe of floating platforms, each one draped in the colors of their world. Not the fact that every eye in that room, compound, singular, stalked, or slitted, was aimed directly at the 6 humans standing in the center of the floor. No, it smelled like old decisions, like a room where things had already been decided before anyone arrived. My name is Sira Vane. I am a commander in the Human Defense Directorate, and I have been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the outcome is settled and the ceremony is just the noise around it. I grew up watching my mother navigate those rooms. She said the trick was simple: never let them see you count the doors. So I didn't count the doors. I stood straight. I kept my face clean and my breathing even, and I watched Ambassador Lena Drax stand at the center of it all as if she had built this room herself. Lena was not a tall woman. She was 43, compact, with short brown hair and the kind of quiet that fills a space the way water fills a jar, completely, without effort, without waste. She wore the blue of our diplomatic corps and nothing else. No medals. No rank pins, no ceremony, just blue and that expression she always wore, which I had spent 3 years trying to name and still couldn't. The presiding counselor was a Vathari elder named Grenorath. He was ancient by any standard, his gray-scaled body draped in the layered robes of his office, his 4 arms folded in the posture that his species used to signal absolute authority. I had read his file. 40 years on the council. 72 resolutions passed, a creature of process and patience and complete certainty that the universe operated according to rules he understood. He began reading. "The Grand Council of Aligned Species," he said, his translator rendering his words in clean, formal English, "has reviewed the full record of humanity's presence in shared galactic space. We have considered the evidence submitted by the Vathari delegation, the Sorvath Compact, the Lelian Choir, and 8 additional member species. We have deliberated for 60 standard days." I watched the other delegations. The Sorvath envoy, all 4 of them identical in their gray wrappings, showed nothing. The Lelians swayed gently, which was how they showed anticipation. The smaller species, the ones who had no real vote but observed as a courtesy, leaned forward in their observation rings. "The charges against the human species," Grenorath continued, "are as follows. First, humanity maintains undisclosed military infrastructure in violation of the Shared Space Accords of 2241. Second, humanity has demonstrated a pattern of aggressive expansion that destabilizes neighboring sectors. Third, the human species, by nature of its biological and psychological profile, presents an unacceptable and unmanageable risk to the continued peace of aligned galactic civilization." I breathed in slowly. Unmanageable risk. Those 2 words had been floating around council chambers for 11 years, ever since humanity had declined to submit to the voluntary disarmament review, ever since Admiral Crane had told the council, with a politeness so sharp it was almost a different thing entirely, that we would not be opening our shipyards to foreign inspection. Ever since Lena herself had sat in a smaller room than this one, and told the Vathari Trade Council that humanity's internal security arrangements were not a subject for negotiation. We had known this vote was coming. We had known it for years. "The Grand Council," Grenorath said, "calls for a formal vote. All species in favor of issuing a declaration of warranted military action against the human species, what under human convention would be recognized as a declaration of war. Please register your mark." The marks came up one by one. Each delegation's symbol appeared on the great display above the chamber floor, lit in red. The Vathari, the Sorvath Compact, the Lelian Choir, 7 others in a cascade of red light that took about 40 seconds. 12 marks, 12 species. 12 declarations. The chamber was quiet in the way that only very large spaces can be quiet. I was aware of my own heartbeat. I was aware of the 2 human officers standing behind me, and the way one of them, young Lieutenant Gideon Cole, 3 months out of officer training, had let out a very small, very controlled breath. I kept my eyes on Lena. She had not moved. She had not looked at the display. She was watching Grenorath with that expression I could never name, and as the last mark appeared and the display burned full red, she tilted her head just slightly to one side, the way a person does when something confirms what they already knew. Grenorath looked down at her. "Ambassador Drac," he said, and there was something in his voice that I think was mercy, the kind of mercy that powerful creatures extend to smaller ones just before the moment of defeat. "The Council has spoken. Humanity has 30 standard days to begin compliance proceedings. We expect your government's formal response within." "At last," Lena said. She said it quietly. She wasn't interrupting exactly. She waited for exactly the right gap in his sentence, the way a musician waits for a rest in the music, and she placed those 2 words into it with absolute precision. The chamber did not erupt immediately. There was a half-second of complete silence, which was somehow louder than the eruption that followed. Grenorath's 4 arms unfolded. The Lelians stopped swaying. The Sorvith envoys turned to each other in a motion I had never seen from them before. 12 delegations, all moving at once, all producing the sounds their species made when they were alarmed. Lena did not move. I did not move. I was watching her face, and I was thinking about something she had told me 18 months ago in a small office on Titan Station, with a cup of tea going cold between her hands. She had been reading through a council report, the kind of dry diplomatic document that most people used to help them fall asleep. She had looked up at me and said, without any particular emphasis, "The thing about very old institutions is that they always believe their own ceremonies. The ceremony becomes the reality to them. They forget that it's just a room full of people making choices." I had asked her what she meant. She had looked at me the way she always looked at people when they asked her to say more plainly the thing she had just said plainly. Then she had gone back to her report. I understood now. The council had called a ceremony. They had dressed it up in robes and platforms and formal language and 60 days of deliberation. They had made it feel like gravity, like something that simply happened to lesser things and could not be resisted. Lena had walked into the room and felt nothing pull. The eruption was still going when she turned and looked at me over her shoulder, just for a moment, that expression which I could never name. I named it then. It was readiness. She turned back to the council and waited for the noise to settle, which it did, because noise always settles eventually. "The council will have our formal response," she said, "within 24 hours. She turned and walked toward the exit. I fell in step behind her, and Gideon followed me, and the other 3 officers followed him. Behind us, the council chamber was still churning, still reorganizing itself around the small earthquake Lena had just placed in its center. Gideon moved up beside me as we walked. He was trying very hard to keep his face neutral and failing slightly. He leaned close and said, very quietly, "Did she know? Did we know this was going to happen today?" I looked at him. "Gideon," I said, "we've known for 100 years. He didn't say anything else. We walked down the long corridor away from the chamber, and ahead of us, Lena Drac moved through the light of Orin 7 like a woman who had just finished waiting for something, and was finally, deeply, ready to begin. Part 2. What humans do when they are afraid. The first thing I did when the alert reached the shipyard was spill my coffee. That is not a dramatic detail I am adding for effect. It genuinely happened. The alarm came through my earpiece at 3:40 station time, a short triple tone that meant priority command relay, and I jolted hard enough to send my mug off the edge of my workbench and onto the floor, where it shattered against the metal grating. I stood there for a second, looking at the pieces. Old ceramic, blue rim. My wife had packed it in my kit when I left for the assignment, which had been supposed to last 6 months and had now lasted 3 years. The handle was still intact. I noted this for no useful reason at all, and then I picked up my comm and answered the relay. "Moss," I said. "Cale." It was Director Owens, and she did not sound like a person who had been asleep. She sounded like a person who had never slept, who ran entirely on information and forward motion. The council vote went through. 12 marks. Declaration issued. I already knew what that meant. Everyone at Shipyard, Omega, knew what that meant. We had been building toward this moment for so long that it had started to feel more like a destination than a crisis. "How long?" I asked. "The ambassador bought us 24 hours before the formal response is due. After that, they'll be expecting either a surrender notice or silence." She paused. "We will not be sending a surrender notice." "Understood." I looked around the bay. It was the night shift, which at Omega meant a skeleton crew of about 60 engineers, monitors, and systems technicians scattered across a facility the size of a small city. In 8 hours, that number would be over 400. I'll begin the full activation sequence. "You have authorization," Owen said. "Full authorization, Cale, all bays." She ended the call. I stood still for one more moment. Just one. Not from fear, exactly. More from the particular weight of a thing that has been theoretical for a long time becoming very suddenly real. 3 years I had spent at Omega. 3 years of building and checking and rechecking and running simulations and fixing errors, and fighting with procurement over components and training crews who cycled in and out and never knew the full picture of what they were part of. 3 years of living inside the longest, most patient preparation in human history. I picked up the intact handle of the broken mug and put it in my pocket. Then I went to work. Shipyard Omega does not appear on any public record. It sits inside a hollowed asteroid in the outer belt, 200 million kilometers from Earth, surrounded by 6 additional false rock platforms that scan as inert mineral deposits. The station runs dark. No outward emissions, no standard navigation beacons, no registered flight paths leading to or from its location. Supply runs come in disguised as routine mining operations. Crew rotations happen through a system of routes that change every 3 weeks. From the outside, it is a rock, nothing more. From the inside, it is a shipyard capable of maintaining, arming, and launching 47 vessels simultaneously. Omega is not the only one. I did not know the full number when I first arrived, because the full number was not the kind of information distributed casually. But by the time the alert came through that morning, I knew enough. I knew about the 4 yards near Jupiter's trailing Trojans. I knew about the pair of facilities carved into the moons of a gas giant in a star system we officially called uninhabited. I knew about the smaller dispersed yards, 30 or 40 of them, each one holding between 4 and 12 vessels in various states of completion. I knew that humanity had been building its actual fleet, quietly, consistently, for 81 years. Long before the Council started making its concerns official. Long before the first mention of the word unmanageable in a diplomatic record. Long before any of us alive today were born. The plan was not a secret because it was shameful. It was a secret because it was necessary. Let me explain what I mean by that. Every other species in the Council had, at some point in their past, gone through what the xenosociologists called the consolidation phase, the period when an advanced civilization stops competing with itself and begins to present a unified face to the wider universe. For the Vathari, it happened 700 years ago, after the last of their continental wars. For the Sorvith, It was a slow process over several generations of political integration. For the Lelians, it was something stranger and more spiritual, a gradual merging of individual will into collective identity. Humans had done none of that. Humans had looked at the universe and done exactly what humans always do when they feel threatened. They had made a plan, kept it quiet, and worked. I remember asking Director Owens in my first month at Omega whether it bothered her, keeping it all hidden, building something massive and saying nothing. She had looked at me with the particular expression that senior directors use when a junior engineer asks a question that is not actually about engineering. Then she had said, "Kale, how many times in human history has a species that wanted to dominate us told us openly what they were planning?" I had no good answer to that. "Exactly," she said. "We learned early. You don't broadcast your preparation, you complete it." That morning, with the Council's declaration sitting fresh in every earpiece on the station, I began the activation sequence for all 47 vessels in Omega's bays. The sequence takes 11 hours if everything works correctly. Things do not always work correctly. That morning, we had a power coupling fault in Bay 9, a pressure integrity warning in Bay 23 that turned out to be a faulty sensor rather than an actual pressure failure, and a fueling system blockage in Bay 31 that required two of my best engineers to spend 4 hours in a crawlspace the width of a kitchen cabinet. I want to be honest about what activation morning looked like, because it was not a clean and cinematic event. It was 400 people doing very specific technical work under a deadline, fueled by bad coffee and worse food from the station canteen, communicating through a comm system that had 3 separate channels running simultaneously and a tendency to drop audio at exactly the wrong moment. It was loud and complicated, and often frustrating and occasionally funny in the dark way that high-pressure situations always produce their own gallows humor. Private Ren Harlow, 22 years old, from a small town in Wales, spent 40 minutes on his hands and knees in Bay 31 fixing the fueling blockage and emerged covered in a lubricant that turned his uniform jacket a spectacular shade of orange. He stood up, looked down at himself, and said, with complete seriousness, "I look like a very upset carrot." Nobody laughed in the moment. We were all too busy, but I remembered it. I remember it still, because it is the kind of moment that a person holds onto when things get harder later. Lieutenant Carla Drew managed the Bay 9 coupling fault with a calm and competence that I have never seen matched in a decade of engineering work. She diagnosed the problem in 8 minutes, sourced a replacement component from secondary stores, led a 4-person team through the installation, and had the bay back online with 6 hours remaining in the sequence. She did all of this while simultaneously talking a first-year technician named Oliver Penn through his first full system diagnostic on a vessel he had never worked on before, because she was Carla Drew, and that was simply the kind of person she was. By the time the sequence was 90% complete, the rest of the yard staff had started appearing in the observation gallery above the main bay floor, not because they were supposed to be there, just because something was drawing them, the same thing that draws people to windows during storms. I went up myself when the final checks were running below. I stood at the rail and looked down into the main bay. 47 vessels, sitting in formation in a space that had been their home for years. Some of them had been here longer than I had. Some of them had been assembled in sections and joined here, piece by piece, over decades of patient construction. They were dark now, running on minimal power, their hulls the color of the asteroid they were hidden inside. They did not look dramatic. They looked functional, which is a different and more serious thing. Oliver Penn was standing next to me. He was 19, which I know because he had mentioned his recent birthday 3 times in the 6 weeks since he arrived. He was looking down at the fleet with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone realizing for the first time that the thing they have been told about is actually real. "I knew it was big," he said quietly. They told us in the briefing. They gave us numbers, but I didn't actually understand what the numbers meant. Most people don't, I said, until they see it. There are more of these, aren't there? It wasn't a question, he had done the math. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a while. The council thinks we have 12 patrol ships and some freighters, he said. Yes. And we have this. Yes. He thought about that. Then he said, why didn't we just tell them? Wouldn't that have stopped the whole thing? I considered the question seriously, because it was a serious question that deserved an honest answer. Maybe, I said, or maybe it would have sped up the vote by 10 years before we were ready. The council saw us as manageable because they thought they knew what we had. Showing them the truth too early was a risk we couldn't take. And now the risk is different, I said. Now they're going to find out whether we show them or not. Oliver nodded slowly. Below us, the final sequence checks were completing one by one. The vast fleet sat still and patient and real, exactly as it had always been, waiting for the moment that had finally arrived. I put my hand in my pocket and felt the broken handle of my coffee mug. My wife had packed it because she knew I hated the station cups. She had said when I left, "Come home when it's done." I had said, "It might be a while." She had said, "I know, come home when it's done." I stood at the rail and watched the last check complete and the final bay indicator go green. It was done, or rather one part of it was done, the part where we prepared. Now came the part where we showed them who we were. Part 3, the first engagement and why they were not ready. I, Admiral Prynne of the Vatheri Armada, have never lost a battle. I say this not as pride. I say it as data. In 32 years of active command, I have engaged enemy forces on 19 occasions. I have returned from all 19. My record is not an accident of luck but a product of method. I study my opponents. I learn their patterns. I find the gap between what they believe about themselves and what they actually are, and I put my forces into that gap and I win. I had studied humanity. I had read every report, every behavioral analysis, every record of human conflict going back 3 centuries. I had reviewed the assessments filed by the 5 council-appointed observation teams who had spent years embedded near human-controlled space. I had read the academic papers produced by xenosociologists, xenopsychologists, and military analysts from 9 different species. The consensus was consistent. Humans were emotionally volatile, organizationally capable, and strategically limited by their individual psychology. They were prone to aggression under pressure but broke quickly under sustained resistance. Their unit cohesion was good at small scale and degraded at large scale. Their command structures were hierarchical, which made them predictable, because hierarchical structures always produce predictable responses. Wait for orders, follow the chain, hesitate when the chain is disrupted. I had felt, walking into this engagement, that I understood humans. I had been wrong before, on small things. The surprise of a unit holding longer than projected. The occasional tactical innovation that fell outside the modeled range, but never wrong about the core of a species, never wrong about the fundamental shape of how they fight. My fleet dropped from high transit at 6:20 standard, at the coordinates designated Zone 7, a sector of contested space approximately 14 light towers from the outermost human-acknowledged installation. The plan was a forward demonstration, a show of superior force, close enough to communicate serious intent, far enough to allow the human leadership time to respond before we were required to engage. A demonstration, a statement. We were not expecting a reply. The human fleet appeared on our sensors 11 minutes after our arrival. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say appeared. At 6:31, our long-range sensor network showed empty space in the direction of the estimated human positions. At 6:32, It showed 49 vessels, arranged in a formation our analyst team had no designation for, moving at a velocity that put them at engagement range in less than 2 hours. 49 vessels. My own fleet numbered 63. We outnumbered them significantly. I was not concerned by the numbers. I was concerned by the 11 minutes. Where did they come from? My sensor chief, a young officer named Vreth, asked the question I was already asking myself. There were no human vessels in this region at our arrival, no transit signatures, no prior positions logged by our advanced scouts. They transited from somewhere dark, said my operations commander Gelsarath. No beacon positions, no mapped routes. That is not possible within the safety parameters of the transit protocols, Vreth said. Gelsarath looked at me. I said nothing because I was thinking. The human vessels were not supposed to be there. More precisely, they were not supposed to have been anywhere that allowed them to arrive there in 11 minutes. The physics of high transit travel created minimum safety windows. Entering transit too close to a gravity source risked emergence anomalies. Every species used these windows. Every species planned around them. Humans had apparently planned around the assumption that other species would plan around them. They had prepositioned vessels in transit, close enough to a gravity source that our scanners had read nothing, waiting. They had been waiting before I arrived. They had been in position before I made my move, which meant they had anticipated my move. That was the first thing. The second thing happened at engagement minus 40 minutes, when the human fleet separated. Not reorganized, separated. What had been one formation of 49 vessels became, over the course of 6 minutes, 7 distinct smaller formations moving in 7 different directions. Not retreating, none of the vectors were away from my position. 5 of the groups angled to intercept from directions I had not anticipated. One moved directly toward my fleet on a straight approach. One moved to a position that I could not immediately explain. Vreth was running projections as fast as her team could produce them. The direct approach group, she said, will reach engagement range in 90 minutes. The flanking groups are timed to arrive simultaneously, within a 14-second window. What is the 7th group doing? I asked. A pause. Holding, Vreth said. They are holding position approximately 60,000 kilometers behind the primary formation. I looked at the display. The 7th group sat like a question I didn't have an answer to yet. They are holding it in reserve, Gelsarath said. It was the obvious answer. It was probably the correct answer. It still bothered me in a way I could not fully explain. I ordered my fleet into the defensive formation we had prepared, a Vathari classic designed to absorb a multi-directional approach. It was a formation with 200 years of successful use behind it. It distributed our superior numbers along the expected angles of contact and left our strongest vessels at the center to reinforce wherever pressure was greatest. It was a good formation. It had always been a good formation. The engagement began at 8:31. The direct approach group hit us first as projected, and here is where the first deviation from the models occurred. They did not slow. Every tactical model I had reviewed on human behavior showed a consistent pattern. Human units, when engaging a larger and better-armed opponent, would throttle back, consolidate, seek positional advantage before committing fully. Caution. Measured approach. These vessels did not throttle back. They came in at full speed and they hit my front line the way weather hits a coast, not looking for the soft parts, not adjusting to the shape of what they struck, just hitting. 2 of my outer vessels took simultaneous strikes from multiple angles, and their defensive systems, designed to handle sequential impacts, were not calibrated for what happened to them. They're not targeting our weapons systems, Vreth said. Her voice had shifted. It had the quality of someone describing something they cannot fully explain. They're targeting our sensor arrays, specifically the long-range relay nodes. They're blinding us, Gelsarath said. Not eliminating our eyes entirely, making the picture blurry, making the 7 formation grid harder to track precisely, buying themselves the cover of imprecision while the flanking groups closed in. The flanking groups arrived at 8:47. The 14-second window Vreth had projected held to within 3 seconds. 5 groups, 5 directions, arriving near simultaneously against a formation designed to handle sequential pressure. We held, I want to be clear about that, my fleet held. Vathari commanders train for exactly this kind of pressure, and the men and women under my command performed exactly as they had been trained. But holding was not the same as winning, and in the 40 minutes that followed, I began to understand something that my 32 years of study had not prepared me for. Human units did not break when they should have broken. In my experience, in the experience of every military analyst whose work I had reviewed, there are moments in an engagement when a unit's tactical position becomes untenable. The math is clear. The damage too high, the reinforcement too far, the alternative too obvious. And at those moments, rational units make the rational choice. They fall back. They consolidate. They preserve what can be preserved. One of the human flanking groups took a level of fire that should have produced exactly that response. By every model I had, they should have pulled back. Instead, they tightened their formation and pushed harder into the gap they had found in my defensive line. I watched a single human vessel take a direct hit that took out 60% of its forward capacity. It did not retreat. It turned, and I watched it turn, watched the decision happen in real time on my display, and it used the remaining 40% of its capacity to push itself directly into contact with one of my midline ships, where it sat and continued to operate until it no longer could. Not a sacrifice maneuver, not a pre-planned terminal strike, a choice made in the moment by someone who had looked at the math of retreat versus the math of staying and had chosen staying. Gelsarath said, very quietly beside me, "They don't think about it the way we think about it." I did not answer him. I was watching the 7th group. It was still holding, 60,000 kilometers back, watching. Every reserve in my experience gets committed. Reserves are an insurance policy against a line breaking. When the line holds, the reserve is released. We were holding. The pressure was severe, but we were holding. Any rational commander would begin to shift that reserve group toward the most vulnerable point in my line. The 7th group held. I could feel the battle shifting in a way that the numbers on my display did not yet reflect. The numbers said we were winning. The numbers were right, technically, but the shape of the thing was wrong. My formation was being slowly and intelligently redirected, not broken, redirected. The human groups were not trying to defeat my fleet. They were trying to move it. "They're hurting us," I said. The room went quiet. Vreth ran the projection without being asked. It took her 40 seconds. Then she turned, and I saw on her face the expression that appears on the faces of very competent people when they realize they have been outmaneuvered. "If our current vectors hold," she said, "in 22 minutes, we will be in a position where the 7th group has a direct, unobstructed approach to our command cluster. 22 minutes of pressure, 22 minutes of not quite breaking, of being pushed in ways that felt like resistance but were actually movement. 22 minutes of watching the 7th group wait, patient and still, for exactly the position they had been holding space for. They had planned this before the engagement started. I gave the order to disengage. It was the right order. I do not regret it as a tactical decision, but I want to record clearly the feeling that accompanied it, because I have given orders in 19 engagements and I have never given one that felt like this. It was not defeat exactly. We had not lost in any measurable sense. We had taken some damage, they had taken more. It was the feeling of being misread. I had read them. I had read everything available on them, and they had done something that none of the reading had prepared me for. They had read me back more accurately. As my fleet reorganized for withdrawal, I sent a priority relay to the Council. I did not dress the message in diplomatic language. I did not soften it for political consumption. I sent what I knew to be true in the plainest terms I had. We were wrong about what they are. We assumed that because humans are an emotional species, they are an unpredictable one. We assumed that because they argue among themselves, they cannot coordinate. We assumed that because they value their lives, they will protect those lives before they protect their objectives. None of these assumptions held. Humans are afraid. I believe, having watched them fight, that they are afraid nearly all the time, aware of every risk, feeling every possible outcome, carrying the weight of their own mortality in a way that my species, with our longer lives and calmer neurology, simply does not. They feel it all. And then they act anyway. I do not know what to call a species that feels fear completely and chooses forward motion regardless. In Vathari philosophy, we call that kind of behavior exceptional, the province of the very rare individual, the hero of stories. Humans appear to do it as a general rule. I sat in my command chair and watched Zone 7 fall behind us, and I thought about the seventh group, still sitting at 60,000 kilometers, patient and still, waiting for the position they wanted, certain it would come. And it did come, because they had arranged for it to come. I have never lost a battle. I have also, in 32 years, never met an opponent I felt I genuinely did not understand. I filed my report. I included that line. I thought the Council should know. I thought it might change something. I was less certain than I should have been about whether it would. Part 4, the thing they never understood about us. I am going to tell you about a moment that did not make it into any official report. It happened on the fourth day of active operations, in a corridor on my command ship between the medical bay and the officers' mess. I was walking, which is something I do when I cannot sleep, which is something that happens to me more during active operations than at any other time. It was 2 in the morning by ship time. The corridor was empty except for one person. Her name was Lieutenant Nina Cross. She was 27. She was from a city in the north of England, and she had been on active duty for 4 years. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, and she was staring at the wall across from her with the kind of expression that has no name in any manual, but that anyone who has served recognizes immediately. I sat down on the floor next to her. I did not ask if she was all right. It was obvious she was not all right, and the question would have been the kind of kindness that is actually an obstacle. We sat for a while. I keep running the numbers, she said eventually. For the Hartley, the crew count. The Hartley was a destroyer we had lost 2 days earlier. 41 crew. We had recovered 9. I know, I said. I trained with 2 of them. At Aberdeen, she paused. It's not that I can't accept it. I accepted it. I know what we're doing and I know what it costs, and I accepted that before I signed my name to anything. It's just that knowing a thing and feeling a thing are not the same thing, and I don't think anyone ever tells you that clearly enough. No, I said, they don't. Does it stop? She asked, not with any particular hope in the question, just asking. No, I said, but it changes. It becomes something you carry differently. She thought about that. That's not comforting, she said. I know. She almost smiled, just the edge of it. Thank you for not lying to me. We sat a while longer. Then she got up and went to the mess, and I went back to walking. And I thought about what she had said, the gap between knowing and feeling, and how that gap is, maybe, the truest thing about humans that no outside species has ever fully grasped. I am Commander Sira Vane. I have been in this war since before it was officially a war, and I have spent 11 years watching the Council study humanity, analyze humanity, model humanity, and consistently miss the center of us. They look at our history of conflict and they see aggression. They look at our speed of expansion and they see hunger. They look at the way we keep building, keep moving, keep reaching, and they see threat. They do not see what is underneath all of that. We are afraid. Not in the way other species manage fear, not as a calculation or a resource to be budgeted. We are afraid the way the planet we came from is violent, constantly, without warning, in every direction at once. Earth does not pause between earthquakes to let you catch your breath. It does not schedule the storms or ask permission for the ice ages. The things that built us never stopped, and so neither did we. Every human being alive carries, somewhere in the back of their mind, the awareness that everything ends. We feel this in a way that the longer-lived species do not. A Vathari lives for 300 years. A Sorvath hive mind persists for longer than human civilization has existed. They have a relationship with mortality that is abstract, distant, philosophical. Our relationship with mortality is intimate, personal, constant. And we chose, as a species, to go into space anyway. That choice, that specific, deliberate, clear-eyed choice to go out into the vast and indifferent dark knowing exactly what we were made of and what could happen to us, is the thing I have never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't born human. The captured Vathari officer helped me understand how wide the gap was. His name was Sub-Commander Orvath, and he had been taken during the operation at Relay Point 7. His vessel had been disabled rather than destroyed, and 3 of his crew had survived alongside him. He was not a bad individual. In the conversations I had with him over 10 days of his being held aboard my ship, pending transfer to a diplomatic processing facility, he was thoughtful, direct, and genuinely curious in a way that I came to respect. On the 6th day, he asked me directly, "What do you want?" I was in the middle of reviewing a logistics report, and I looked up, because the question was plain in a way that diplomatic conversations usually aren't. "What do you want?" he said again. "From this, from the engagement, from winning if you win, what is the goal?" I put down the report. "What do your analysts say our goal is?" I asked. "Territory," he said, "resource access, political standing, a seat on a restructured council with greater weight." He paused. "Those are the material goals. The psychological models suggest dominance behavior, the desire to be recognized as the primary power in this region of space. And does that fit what you've seen?" He considered carefully before answering. He was the kind of officer who answered carefully. "No," he said, "it does not. Your fleet's behavior in combat does not match expansion objectives. You defend aggressively, but your advances are tactical. You take positions that constrain our movement, not positions that give you resources or territory. And the terms your ambassador has communicated through back channels are," he paused again, "not what a species seeking dominance would ask for." "What do we ask for?" "To be left alone," he said, "with acknowledgement." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't understand that," he said, and he was being honest, not diplomatic, not adversarial, genuinely, clearly honest. If you have the capacity to take more, why would you not take more? I thought about Nina Cross in the corridor. I thought about the Hartley and its 41 crew and the 9 who came home. I thought about Ren Harlow covered in orange lubricant in a maintenance crawlspace. I thought about Lena Drack in the council chamber, receiving the declaration of war with the quiet of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is finally allowed to put it down. "Because we didn't start this to get more," I said. "We started this because we needed you to understand what you were threatening." He looked at me. "The council voted to declare war on a species without fully understanding what that species is," I said. "We are not fragile. We are not manageable. We are not something that collapses under pressure. And we needed you to know that, not because we want power over you, but because the alternative is a galaxy where you keep underestimating us, keep making decisions about us based on wrong information, keep pushing until something happens that is much worse than this. You went to war to teach us a lesson," he said. We went to war, I said, because you declared it. We stayed in it long enough to make sure you understood the lesson. He sat with that for a while. And the terms your ambassador is offering, he said eventually, they are genuinely lenient. Yes. Why? I looked at him. I thought about how to say the true thing in a way that would reach someone who had grown up in a civilization that had not spent its entire evolutionary history fighting for survival against its own planet. Orvith, I said, do you know what the most dangerous predator on Earth is? He waited. Historically, it was us, humans. We drove species to extinction not through malice but through expansion, through need, through being the kind of animal that does not stop adapting. We are the most dangerous thing our planet ever produced. I paused. And we spent the last 300 years deciding not to be that, choosing deliberately to protect instead of consume, to share instead of take, to build things that last instead of burning through them. He said nothing. That choice cost us something, I said. It costs every generation. It is not our nature to be peaceful. It is our discipline. And the reason we ask for lenient terms is because the kind of species we chose to be does not take more than it needs. The conversation stayed with me for a long time after he was transferred. The council's envoys arrived on the 14th day. There were 7 of them, from 5 different species, and they came through a neutral relay point in a vessel with all its weapons powered down as a gesture of good faith. I met them in the conference bay of my command ship. They were expecting a different room. I could see it in the way they moved when they entered, cautious, braced, waiting for something cold and formal and punishing. The room was bright. There was actual food on the table, Earth food, simple things, bread and fruit, and a pot of tea that Lieutenant Carla Drew had insisted on providing because, as she put it, we are not going to sit across from the people who voted to erase us and offer them nothing to eat. The lead envoy, a Sorvith representative named Collective Voice Saren, looked at the table for a moment before sitting. Then they looked at me. You could have pushed further, Saren said. After Zone 7, our flanking positions were compromised. Your admiral had options. I know, I said. You pulled back. Yes. Why? I poured tea and slid the cup across the table. Because we had made the point, I said, and because we are not here to end you. We are here to continue existing alongside you. The difference matters. Saren looked at the tea, then they picked it up. The negotiations lasted 3 days. They were not easy days. There were moments of friction and several moments where the conversation stopped entirely while everyone in the room took a breath and remembered what the alternative looked like. But they continued. And in those 3 days, something shifted, not dramatically, not with any single moment of revelation, but slowly, the way the light changes in the morning, so gradual you cannot point to exactly when the dark became day. On the last day, as the final documents were being reviewed, one of the smaller species envoys, a Lelian observer named Wavecrest, said something I did not expect. I have studied human communication patterns for many years, Wavecrest said. Their translator rendered their tone as careful, almost gentle. And there is something I have always wondered. Humans say I'm fine when they are not fine. They say it's nothing when something is wrong. They say I'm okay after things that are clearly not okay. Why do you do that? I looked at Wavecrest. Because saying how you actually feel would slow everything down, I said, and we can't afford to slow down. Wavecrest was quiet. That sounds very lonely, Wavecrest said. Sometimes, I said, but it keeps things moving, and moving is how we survive. On the evening of the 3rd day, I went back to the corridor outside the medical bay. I don't know why exactly. Habit, maybe, or something that wasn't quite superstition but lived in the same neighborhood. Nina Cross was not there. She was on duty somewhere on the ship doing her job, doing it well, I was certain. I stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about what she had said, knowing and feeling, the gap between them. I thought about Lena Drac in the council chamber, looking at 12 red marks and smiling. I thought about the 41 crew of the Hartley. I thought about Oliver Penn, standing at the observation rail in Omega, seeing the fleet for the first time and understanding what the numbers meant. I thought about 100 years of quiet shipyards and patient work, and a species that never stopped preparing because it never forgot what happened to things that stopped preparing. We are not the most peaceful species in this galaxy. We are not the oldest or the wisest or the most philosophically evolved. We do not live the longest or carry the calmest hearts. We are the species that endures. Not because we don't feel the weight of things, because we feel it completely, every gram of it, and we carry it anyway, and we keep walking. That is who we are. And now the council knew it. The documents were signed on the morning of the fourth day. I sent the confirmation to Lena's office and to Director Owens at Omega and to every ship in our operational group. The message was 3 words. It's done, go home. I received over the next 6 hours approximately 300 responses. Most of them were short. Most of them were things like understood and acknowledged and confirmed. A few were longer. Gideon Cole sent 4 paragraphs about what this meant and then apologized for the length. Ren Harlow, from some ship or station I couldn't immediately identify, sent a single sentence. I am going to buy a new coffee mug. I read it twice. Then I laughed, a real one, the kind that comes up from somewhere below the ribs. I hadn't heard that sound from myself in a while. I sent back, get a good one. He sent back a thumbs up. I filed my final operational report, poured the last of the tea, and watched the stars through the viewport of my command ship. It was quiet, actually quiet. The kind of quiet that means something, that has weight and texture to it, that tells you the loud part is finished and the next part hasn't started yet. I sat with the quiet for a while. Then I started writing the letter I owed my crew. Not a formal report, not an official commendation, just words from me about what they had done and who they were and what it meant. It took me a long time to get it right. Some things are worth the time. Part 5, the terms we offered and why they should be grateful for them. I am Lena Drac, and I have been here before. Not in this room, exactly. The first time I stood in this chamber, I was a junior diplomatic aide, 22 years old, carrying files for a trade negotiation that had nothing to do with war or declarations or the long, complicated question of what humanity was allowed to be. I stood at the back and watched the senior ambassador of the time, a sharp, patient woman named Helen Ford, navigate the council's protocols with the specific kind of grace that comes from knowing exactly where the floor ends and the pit begins. She was very good at her job. She spent 40 years being very good at her job. She retired 6 months before the council's first formal censure of human military posture was filed, which I have always suspected was not entirely a coincidence. She taught me 2 things that I have never forgotten. The first was, read the room, but don't let the room read you back. The second was, the only leverage that matters is the leverage they don't know you have. I thought about Helen Ford when I walked back into the Grand Council chamber for the second time in 13 months. I thought about her because I could hear, faintly, what she might have said if she had been standing next to me, watching the 12 delegations arrange themselves in their horseshoe of floating platforms, watching Grenoreth settle his ancient body into the presiding seat, watching 12 species try to compose their faces into expressions of neutral authority while clearly wrestling with a situation that none of them had expected to be in. Helen would have said, "Well, here we are." And then she would have poured herself a coffee and gotten to work. Here we are. The chamber smelled different this time. It smelled like all large rooms smell when the people inside them are not entirely comfortable, slightly too warm, slightly too close. the particular atmosphere of a space where many minds are working hard to appear certain. The delegations were the same as before, the same 12 species. Some of the individual representatives had changed. The Lelian choir sent 3 different voices than before, and the Sorvith collective voice was now Saren, whom I had met across a conference table on Commander Vane's ship and found, despite everything, to be a thoughtful and genuinely honest negotiating partner. Saren met my eyes when I entered. They did not look away. I respected that. Grenoreth called the session to order. His voice was the same, deep and formal and worn smooth by decades of use, like a river stone. But something in his posture was different from the last time I had stood in this room. The last time, he had sat with the absolute ease of someone who holds all the relevant cards. Today, he sat with the careful stillness of someone who is being very deliberate about not showing which cards they hold, because the nature of the game has changed. "This session of the Grand Council," he said, "is convened to receive and formally consider the terms proposed by the human delegation in resolution of the conflict initiated by Council Declaration 13 months prior." He did not call it a war. The Council had not called it a war in their official communications throughout. They had called it a military action, a conflict event, a period of contested engagement. I had noticed this and had not commented on it, because there are things not worth the fight and there are things worth waiting on. I set the document case on the table in front of me. It was a plain case, no insignia, no ceremony. The documents inside had been drafted over 3 months by a team of 17 people working out of a relay station that was not on any public record, reviewed by 2 independent legal teams, and revised 6 times before I was satisfied. They were the most carefully written words I had produced in a career of carefully written words. They were also, by the standard of what a winning side typically presents to a losing one, spectacularly gentle. "Ambassador Drac," Grenoreth said, "the Council is prepared to hear your terms." I opened the case. I removed the primary document, physical, because the Council still conducted formal proceedings in physical format, a tradition that was 300 years old and showed no sign of changing. I placed it on the table in front of me. "Humanity's terms are as follows," I said. I heard the chamber go quiet. The particular kind of quiet that happens when many minds are bracing for something. First, formal recognition by the Grand Council of aligned species of humanity's status as a sovereign Tier 1 civilization with full independent military rights, not subject to Council review, restriction, or sanction, without the presentation of specific documented cause. I paused. Second, expungement of the declaration of conflict from the Permanent Council record, to be replaced by a joint statement acknowledging a period of mutual misunderstanding and affirming humanity's place as a full and equal member of galactic civilization. Another pause. Third, establishment of a joint Human Council liaison office with equal representation to handle future disputes through structured dialogue before any punitive measures are considered. I looked up from the document. "Those are our terms." The chamber was quiet in a new way, not the braced quiet from before, something more confused. The Sorvith envoy who sat beside Saren said something in their own language, a rapid exchange that the translator rendered as a question and a short answer. A Lelian voice said, "Is there more?" The smaller delegations in the observation ring were doing the thing they always did when genuinely surprised, slightly random movement, a scatter of small behaviors that were the equivalent of people glancing at each other. Grenoreth studied me. "Ambassador," he said, "are those the complete terms?" "Yes." "There are no reparation demands?" "No." "No territorial claims?" "No." "No restructuring of council composition?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "You are presenting 3 conditions, all procedural, none of which impose any material cost on the council or its member species." That is correct. He looked at the document in front of me as if it might reveal something the words themselves were concealing. Ambassador Drac, he said, carefully, humanity was, by any standard assessment, the party that prevailed in the military engagement. The party that prevailed typically does not offer terms of this nature. Typically, I agreed. Then perhaps you could explain to the council, he said, and now there was something new in his voice, not quite vulnerability, but something adjacent to it, something that in a human face would have looked like genuine puzzlement. Why? I had thought about this moment for a long time. I had written several versions of what I might say here and discarded all of them except one, which I had written in a single sitting in the early hours of a morning 3 weeks ago, and which I had not revised because it came out right the first time. The way some things do when you've been thinking about them long enough. Grenoreth, I said, how old is the council? He blinked, the slow, deliberate blink of his species. The Grand Council of Aligned Species has existed in its current form for 312 years. And in 312 years, has any species declared a conflict against a council member, and then, upon prevailing, offered terms like these? A pause, no. Has any species that prevailed in a conflict against a council member chosen not to seize territory? The Vathari took minimal territory after the Sorvith engagement of. Not minimal, I said. None. Has any species chosen to take no territory? A longer pause. Not in our recorded history. Then perhaps, I said, the Council is working from a model of what victorious species do that doesn't include the possibility of a species that is victorious and chooses restraint. Grenoreth looked at me with those ancient eyes that had seen 40 years of politics and 72 resolutions, and I suspected a great deal of things that he had filed away in places he very rarely opened. Is it restraint? He asked, not skeptically, genuinely. It is calculation, I said. Honest calculation. I looked around the chamber, 12 species, 12 sets of eyes. Humanity does not want to administer a galactic empire. We do not have the temperament for it, and more importantly, we don't have any interest in it. What we want is to exist, fully and without apology, as what we are. A space to build and explore and disagree with each other loudly, which we do, constantly, and which is nobody else's problem but ours. I paused. What we want, I said, is the same thing every species in this room wants, to be understood correctly. The room was very still. You declared conflict against us, I said, because you did not understand us. You read our history and saw violence. You looked at our fleet and saw aggression. You studied our psychology and saw instability. You were working with accurate data and arriving at wrong conclusions because the model you were using was built without input from us. Saren spoke then from their platform, and the correct model. I thought about Commander Vane sitting on the floor in a corridor next to a lieutenant who could not sleep. I thought about Engineer Kale Moss standing at a railing above 47 ships, his hand in his pocket around the handle of a broken mug. I thought about Subcommander Orvith, drinking tea in a conference room and asking why we didn't take more. I thought about a very young Gideon Cole trying to keep his face neutral in the council chamber 13 months ago and not quite managing it. I thought about Ren Harlow covered in orange lubricant saying, he looked like a very upset carrot. I thought about Helen Ford, 40 years of careful work, and the two things she had taught me. The correct model, I said, is a species that is afraid, deeply, persistently, historically afraid of extinction, of loss, of the darkness between stars. A species that came from a world that tried on a geological timescale to end us repeatedly. That has faced plagues and famines and ice ages and every form of catastrophe a planet can produce and kept going. Not because we are brave in the way the stories tell it, not because we feel no fear. Because we feel all of it and move forward anyway. I paused. A species like that, I said, does not want an empire. It does not want to rule. It wants to know that the things it has built will not be taken away. It wants to know that the distance it has come from a single frightened planet to the edge of galactic civilization will not be negated by a vote in a room it was not allowed to shape. Grenorath said nothing. He was listening with the full attention of someone who has stopped waiting for the part they will disagree with and started simply receiving what is being said. Here is the other part of the model, I said. The part that matters most that no external assessment ever captured. Humanity, when it has the power to take and chooses not to, has made that choice more times than your records show. We have been in conflicts, internal conflicts, territorial disagreements, resource crises, that could have ended in domination and chose instead to negotiate. Not because we couldn't win, because winning everything is not the same as getting what you actually need. And what do you need? Saren asked. To be part of this, I said, fully. Not as a managed species, not as a monitored threat, not as a problem to be contained. As a member, with all the rights and all the responsibilities that come with that. The chamber was quiet for a long time. And then Grenorath did something I had not seen a Vathari elder do in 13 years of diplomatic work. He folded all 4 arms across his body, which in Vathari body language is the posture of acknowledgement. Not agreement necessarily. Not yet. But acknowledgement, the physical expression of I hear you, and I am genuinely considering what you have said. The council, he said, will deliberate. The deliberation lasted 2 days. I spent those 2 days in the human delegation's quarters on the station, which were not comfortable but were private, which is what mattered. I worked. I answered communications. I ate regular meals and slept a reasonable number of hours, which I had learned many years ago was not a weakness but a necessity. The decisions that come from an exhausted mind have a particular shape that I had learned to recognize in my own work and to distrust. Lieutenant Gideon Cole, who had been assigned to my diplomatic staff after the declaration, and had proven himself one of the sharper minds I had worked with, spent those 2 days in a mild, contained panic that he managed with great professionalism. He had a habit of straightening things that were already straight, which meant that by the end of day 2, every item on the shared work table was aligned to a degree that approached the scientific. On the morning of day 3, I received the message from the council secretary that the deliberation was complete. I put on my blue diplomatic corps jacket. I did not put on medals or rank pins. I drank a cup of tea that Gideon had made. He had learned how I took it somewhere around the 2nd month and had been making it correctly ever since without ever mentioning it. Small considerate acts are how competent people show care in professional settings, and I have always valued that. I went back to the chamber. Grenorath was already in the presiding seat. The 12 delegations were assembled. The display above the chamber floor was dark. The Grand Council of Aligned Species, Grenorath said, has reviewed the terms proposed by Ambassador Drac of the human delegation. We have considered the context, the precedent, and the implications. I stood at the center of the floor. The Council accepts the terms as presented, he said, with one addition which we submit for the Ambassador's consideration. I had not expected an addition. I kept my face still. Please present it. The Council wishes to formally include in the joint statement, Grenorath said, an acknowledgement that the declaration of conflict issued 13 months prior was made on the basis of incomplete information, and that the responsibility for that incompleteness rests with the Council. I looked at him. We were wrong, he said simply. Not only about your capacity, about your character. The record should reflect that. I let that sit for a moment. The human delegation accepts the addition, I said. The documents were brought forward, physical copies per the Council's tradition. The presiding counselor of each delegation signed 12 signatories in order of seniority. Grenorath was last. He pressed his mark to the document with the deliberate slowness that the old use when they want a moment to last, and then he looked up at me. Ambassador, he said, I have one question that is not part of the official record. I ask it as an individual, not as a counselor. Ask it, I said. When you stood in this room 13 months ago and we issued the declaration, he said, and you said at last, what did you mean? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I meant that we had been waiting, I said. Not for war, not for this specific event. We had been waiting for the point at which the gap between what the council thought we were and what we actually are would become impossible to maintain, where the fiction would have to break. I paused. We had been living inside someone else's misunderstanding of us for a long time. It is exhausting carrying that. At last meant, now we can stop pretending to be what they think we are and simply be what we are. Grenoreth was quiet. It must have been a long wait. He said. 100 years, I said, give or take. He nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone who understands long timescales. The session closed. The delegations began to disperse. I stood for a moment in the center of the chamber floor with the signed documents in the case under my arm, and I looked up at the gold-laced columns that stretched 30 meters above me. The room still smelled like old decisions. But it felt different. Saren came to stand beside me before leaving, which surprised me slightly. They were quiet for a moment. I want to ask something, Saren said. The offer you included the part about protection, the human willingness to stand between threats and other species who ask. The council received that communication. We discussed it. And we do not fully understand it, Saren said. It appears to be unconditional, without a formal treaty structure, without compensation arrangements. Yes, I said. Why? I thought about how to say it simply. Because we know what it feels like, I said, to be small and frightened in a big and indifferent universe. We were there once. We were there for most of our history, and we found out the hard way that nobody was coming to help us, so we helped ourselves. I looked at Saren. We're not interested in repeating that experience, and we would rather be the thing that comes when someone calls than spend our time wondering if someone will come when we do. Saren was quiet. That is a remarkable way to think, they said. It's a very human way to think, I said. I walked out of the chamber. Gideon was waiting in the corridor, his jacket perfectly straight, his face doing the thing it did when he was trying very hard to read me and couldn't. I had always found it endearing. Well, he said. Signed, I said, complete. He let out a breath, not dramatic, contained, professional, but real. I'll transmit to the director, he said. Do that and Gideon. Yes. Good work, I said, genuinely this whole time. He looked slightly startled, the way people do when they receive direct acknowledgement they weren't expecting. Thank you, Ambassador. We walked down the corridor and out of the station and into the docking arm where our shuttle waited. I sat down, buckled in, and looked out the viewport as the station fell away behind us. I thought about Helen Ford. I thought about her 40 years, her patience, her 2 pieces of advice. I thought about whether she would have approved of how this ended. She would have had notes. She always had notes. She would have found 3 things to do differently and told me about them with the particular directness she used when she respected the person she was correcting. But I thought she would have been satisfied, in the deep and quiet way that experienced people are satisfied when a thing goes right after a very long time of going carefully. I pulled out my notebook, physical, because I keep my most important thoughts in formats that don't require a network, and wrote 1 line. Not for the record, not for any report, just for me. They thought they were declaring war on us. They were right, just not about who we were a threat to. I closed the notebook. Outside the viewport, the stars were steady and old and indifferent, the way they have always been, the way they will be long after every war and council and declaration is forgotten by the universe that contains them. But we were out here. Humanity was out here, in the dark, with our fear and our coffee mugs and our 12-hour activation sequences, and our junior officers who couldn't sleep, and our engineers who made orange lubricant jokes in crawl spaces. Out here building and moving, and enduring the way we always have. At last,